Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Conversation Starters. My name is Dan Haumschild, the Education Director at the Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and here in this program, we try to extend the conversation beyond the current exhibit. The current exhibit, of course, is Then They Came for Me, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and the demise of civil liberties, which is generously sponsored by the Ibuki Family Foundation, which makes admission to the Jewish Museum Milwaukee free through May 29th. So please come on down and take a look. Today's conversation, we have the opportunity to take a deeper dive into one of the places that was used to imprison persons of Japanese descent, namely the Minidoka Relocation Center near Jerome, Idaho. This site is now managed by the National Park Service with support from the nonprofit Friends of Minidoka. And the purpose of Minidoka National Historic Site is to provide opportunities for public education and interpretation of the exclusion and unjust incarceration of people of Japanese ancestry in the United States during World War II. Minidoka National Historic Site protects and collaboratively manages resources related to the Minidoka Relocation Center and the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial in Washington State. And with me today is Kurt Ikeda, the Director of Interpretation and Education at Minidoka. Kurt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having us, Dan, and we're so excited to be partnering with you a few ways across the United States. I'm so happy to be talking to you virtually today, all the way here in Jerome, Idaho, where I'm calling you from.
Fantastic. Now, most of the people who are watching this know the broad history of Japanese incarceration during World War II, but I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of the taste of what that looked like specifically at Minidoka.
Absolutely. And I think one of the best ways to start off our conversation today is to call back to some of the words of our survivors. One specific one I'm thinking about is when folks come to visit, and I hope they do after this video, they're excited to come visit, will be a quote on the very front of our visitor center. It's by one Dr. Frank Kitamoto, who was from Bainbridge Island and was incarcerated at Minidoka. And it reads, "This is not just a Japanese American story, but an American story with implications for the world." And I think as a thematic point, as we think about today's talk and the connections of this story of civil liberties and civil injustices and connecting those to those of the past and those current and potentially in the future, I think it really encompasses this specific story of a group of people of color and how the story connects to all American history and even beyond. But when someone does come to visit Minidoka National Historic Site here in Jerome, you'll be able to explore a bit about the history of what happened here at Minidoka. Minidoka was specifically chosen because of its barren landscape, as Japanese Americans during the incarceration during World War II, of course, was faced with moving or being moved, forcibly removed to these concentration camps. They were first taken out of their West Coast communities, so post Pearl Harbor and the signing of Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942. Then this led into a whole spring and summer of a forced removal of Japanese Americans. Folks who've gone to the exhibit would know there was a forced removal first to what was called assembly centers, euphemistically, what we know and call now as temporary detention centers. And the majority of those who ended up at Minidoka were from the Pacific Northwest region. So these would be folks from Washington, from Oregon, mostly around the Seattle and Portland metropolitan areas, as well as a handful of people even from Alaska. 135 people from Alaska were forcibly removed from their homes and first sent to temporary detention centers. These concentrated in the cities of Portland, in the Portland Expo Center, a livestock yard, as well as in Puyallup, which is the Puyallup Fairgrounds of today. And as we get towards more closer to the fall, around the August 10th, 1942 date, then you have a mass incarceration. First, another mass removal from these detention centers to Minidoka, totaling at over 13,000 people who would come through the barbed wire fences of Minidoka and the military police station to then be incarcerated here for a total of up to 3 years. When you consider that history alongside the population, those from the densely forested and very beautiful Pacific Northwest, I myself having spent some time and living there, the real stark difference in that environment and coming to the high desert here in Idaho was startling. One survivor, Miss Joni Kimoto of Portland, told me a story of how her mother and her, when they got off the train, and these trains, Dan, I'm speaking about them, these were trains that had their window shades drawn down. such that the Japanese Americans who were being forced to be removed here did not even know where they were going. They had a name, Minidoka, they had a state, Idaho, but really no context of what that meant. So Joni, being a young little girl at that point, and her mother and her holding her hand, coming off of that train as they walked into Minidoka for the first time. She remembers these dust storms, just dust storms everywhere. And you hear this a lot in a lot of the stories that our survivors in this community speak of. And she looked up at her mother, and her mother, with tears streaming down her face, said, "Joni, this is our home now." And I don't want to lose that context that we talk about today. There's so many numbers and statistics. We look at the over 120,000 people who were affected by this incarceration directly, and the whole Japanese American community that still feels the intergenerational trauma. At the end of the day, these were all individual stories. And for one little girl from Portland, Oregon, this was her home for 3 years. Mm-hmm. Now, I think if we keep that individual human connection to the story, I think this would be a lot more of a broad conversation for a lot of folks to connect to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, obviously, the story that you just told in that very short span is emotionally laden and incredibly powerful. And I wonder, given the potency of this experience and given the sort of visceral complexity of this experience, I wonder, in the immediate aftermath of 1945, what was the impetus, or where did the impetus come from to actually preserve this site? Was it an immediate thing that people were invested in, or did that come later?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we think about preservation, I think it always helps to think about context and just how large this space was. When we think about Minidoka as a whole, there was over 33,000 acres of land that was set aside for what was at that point called Minidoka Relocation Center. Just some quick numbers: you have 600 plus buildings, and in the space of the residential area, about a 3-mile span, almost 1,000 acres or so that was used specifically for the residential space of Minidoka. When we think about 13,000 people and a peak population of over 8,000 to 9,000 people at one time, you're looking at what became the 7th largest city in Idaho, more or less doubling the population of the county. So this huge, massive space that was moving, and including that space, of course, is the community the Japanese Americans built. It also includes the white employees, the War Relocation Authority that ran that camp, and those individual stories, that both good and bad, that come from these stories. You have the stories of war and service, and all the individual stories of those who were incarcerated there and faced the inhumane and the inhumanity of mess hall eating, of latrines late at night, of searchlights following, as one survivor may remember. So in comparison to that, right, true hustle and bustle of a concentration camp in our country today, we have 5 buildings, right, from 600 buildings to now 5. So the question would then be, well, how did that happen, right? Where did this preservation work come in? Well, as you said, yes, in 1945, starting from January 1945, Japanese Americans were able to return back to the West Coast. But by able to return back to the West Coast being a consideration of what money was available for them to be able to do so, those who left got a train ticket and $25 at that time back to a place, or as they were suggested to, mostly towards the Midwest and actually to the East Coast. Was there a place for them to return to? Chances are these Japanese Americans, when they were forced out of the West Coast, didn't have anything left, or maybe had a lucky neighbor who would promise to preserve that space or that farm or that house for them. And some folks maybe even returned to find that not to be the case. The anti-Asian sentiment along the West Coast, both pre-Pearl Harbor, of course, and during World War II and even immediately after, was still very much an uncomfortable and extremely difficult reality for Japanese Americans and all Asian Americans at that time. Nonetheless, in 1946, this specific portion of Minidoka was then passed back to the Bureau of Reclamation. And I say reclamation to more or less simply say to reclaim land, make it heritable, make it farmable, and then to make it productive for the American public. So from 1946 into the 1950s, you have something called the homesteading period here. of the land that was Minidoka. These parcels of land were more or less broken up into about 90 acres each. And each of these buildings was essentially cut in half or taken whole and put onto trucks and sent out and essentially used to provide housing opportunities, farmstead opportunities for GIs who are returning back from World War II. And when I say GIs, some folks might think about, well, I wonder if those Japanese Americans who served from these camps and also around the United States who bravely serve in a segregated unit, I wonder if they got that same privilege. And sadly, the answer is no. The majority of these GIs who did get the opportunity for the Homestead Act were white GIs. So with that said, the mystery of where these buildings went are actually strewn around here as puzzle pieces around the greater Intermountain West, alongside not just Minidoka, but Heart Mountain in Wyoming and the 8+ others, right, making a total of 10 American concentration camps. These barracks, you could see, especially in this portion of where I'm calling you from, remnants of these barracks that have now been repurposed and reused into things from, pizza parlors all the way to people's homes multiple generations later. So when we think about the 50s into the 60s, you're also looking at very much a community that's still processing this grief and trauma. I know, Dan, yourself with your studies in genocide studies, there's probably a lot to be said about what intergenerational trauma does to a community. When we think about the Japanese American community, a lot of times you might hear some of the generational numbers that we use to describe this. The Issei being the first generation, those who weren't allowed to become citizens until 1952, and we could say, for argument's sake, who lost the most, who suffered the most truly in this country. You would have the second generation, these American-born American citizens by birthright, who were living in this kind of dual society, also facing the incarceration, and how that frames their understanding of this nation. Joni, who I was speaking of very earlier, she was a young Nisei girl, and she lived with this, right, throughout her whole life, as she still does and tells a story today in Portland. Then you have the Sansei generation. These are the people who, more or less may have come into their own during the civil rights movement, the third generation Japanese Americans, some of whom would have maybe been born in camp, just depending on when they were born, but a lot of handful who may have been born after the camp experience. And really it was this conversation between the third, second, and first generation Japanese Americans that began the process of preservation. Third generation asking their parents and then their grandparents, of course, what happened to them during the war. And a lot of times you hear stories of folks saying, well, my parents never talked about it. And you can understand why something like that might be the case. This also manifested in different ways, like Sansei being told by their families to make sure to be the quiet American, to make sure to not cause any trouble, because this could always happen again, right? This kind of innate fear of being the other or being otherized led to, I think, a greater movement in the third generation of Japanese Americans to then say, this story is important. The story of our parents and grandparents are important. Leading into the inspiration from the civil rights movement, the 70s and 80s, you have a full movement of Japanese Americans who are finally speaking out, or finally able to speak out and be heard. Some people who know their history and have gone through the exhibit would know that in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was signed by President Ronald Reagan, which led to the official apology of reparations and redress for the Japanese American community. And this is, of course, including prior years, including President Ford, who also made designations of more or less apologies and re-examining the executive order. But really in 1988, you have this $20,000 check and a letter, right, to each surviving person of the incarceration at that time. And this truly was a moment of healing within the community. Now, when we think about Minidoka in 1979, it was established as a part of the National Register of Historic Places. And in 1990, a memorial plaque was placed out for the Idaho State Centennial Project that truly marked that here in what is mostly left as just this military police building of basaltic rock. And if you come through our park, you'll be the first thing you see. Really, there wasn't much left, but there was this plaque and this designation that was organized by the local community here in Idaho, specifically with partnership with the Japanese American Citizens League and the Pocatello Blackfoot chapter, that led to the commemoration of this site at the earliest level. And then fast forwarding to 2001, the designation of Minidoka, at that time, Minidoka Internment National Monument, in 2001 under President Clinton. Then in 2008, with the expansion of Minidoka National Historic Site under President Bush, to a total of 407.5 acres of space and land that is protected. And also a little bit of land also in Bainbridge Island in Washington, a little bit outside of Seattle, that protects the story of the first group of Japanese Americans who were forcibly removed. I know that was a lot of history to throw at you, but all this to be said, the Japanese American history and the preservation of these lands was a community-led effort, but not one that was easy or quickly brought about, but one that took healing, time, and a populace that was ready to hear out the stories and to hold this story as an important part of our American history.
That was really wonderful context. And I think what is so striking about it, and as you mentioned at the beginning, it almost happened too late, right? There was these 600 plus buildings on site, and now there are 5, you say? And so it's really striking to think about that physically, almost as the dwindling of memory in a physical form. And I'm interested to know a little bit more about the specific physical remnants that are still on site, that when people come to Minidoka in the future, what will they see specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. As folks are driving out of usually Twin Falls, within about a 30-minute drive from Twin Falls is where we are here in Jerome County, in Jerome, Idaho. You'll be driving through and expecting to see the sea of sagebrush that was discussed and spoken about in these oral histories. But what you realize, a lot of this land had been turned into farmland. And that farmland, as folks are driving through, we encourage them to reflect upon how that specific piece of farmland may have been and probably would have been a result of this Japanese American forced labor had happened here at this camp, including irrigation ditches that was dug out with hand tools by Japanese Americans to make this area farmable land. As they drive in and pass this entrance sign, which is right behind me in my virtual background, they'll be faced with a recreation of a guard tower. As folks drive in, they will also see on the right-hand side of the street a military police station, basaltic rock. This has stood the test of time and stands as a monument here at the site. And then on the other side of the street, a military honor roll that was established in 2011 by our Friends group, by the Friends of Minidoka, in support with their efforts. And more or less driving on Hunt Road, you'll see kind of on the outskirts of the area, mostly farmland, as that is the reality of Minidoka today. But off in the distance on what we call Block 22, which is around the center of where camp was, they will see our demonstration block. And there is a historic mess hall, as well as a historic barrack representing in a specific block the 12 barracks that would have stood in terms of the apartments, quote unquote, of where families would have lived, as well as a mess hall that would have centralized where folks would have been eaten. And then while it's not there, there would have been in that space a community building and also a latrines, as well as laundry room there as well. But nonetheless, we have a demonstration barrack where folks can walk into with a ranger guided tour to see and feel some of that history in person. And then as folks are walking around, they'll see a baseball diamond that was recreated through community efforts, as well as the wishes of the community, to discuss some of the ways the Japanese American community found hope and respite, as well as even just simple recreation that led to improved mental health in the scope of an incarceration experience. And the baseball field is a story that carries a lot for many Japanese American families. And then a fire station that has been preserved and still kept on site. And then a little blue house right in front of that fire station, which is the Herman House Farmstead, which essentially represents the story of the exact family who came to steward this area after World War II. And the last thing, which is very interesting, which folks may not particularly know about or see too often if they're not from this area, is a building that's more or less kind of falling off on its side and a few degrees off to the left-hand side, which is a root cellar. And this root cellar is a structure that Japanese Americans had built while they were here. And a root cellar, if you didn't know, would be something that folks use to store vegetables after harvest season, root vegetables like potatoes, for example, since we're in Idaho. And a good statistic to consider is, over 1 million pounds of potatoes was harvested, and a good number of that being stored within this root cellar as well. And last but not least is the visitor center, which we happily had a grand opening in 2020 and a soft opening in 2019, and we are operating it in full this year in 2022. And that visitor center is a refurbished, more or less, building of a historic warehouse that we had at the park. It is now a state-of-the-art visitor center for folks who will learn more if they are interested about this very important story.
I'm interested too in what these homes looked like, right? You mentioned Joni having this experience of being told that this is what home is now. And you mentioned the barracks in particular, and I think a lot of people are interested in the space inside of that barracks. And of course, very few places still have opportunities to see what this really looked like and felt like. Could you describe just very briefly, like the dimensions of that, how many people were usually housed in those barracks, and what it looks like from the inside?
Yeah, absolutely. So a barrack traditionally here at Minidoka was 20 by 120, so very, very long. And then each barrack was broken up into 6 different sections to house 6 different units, usually families. And then in terms of dimension of the barracks, it kind of gets small from the outside for being able to house 3 to 4 people, then a little bit larger for about 4 to 6 people, then the center ones being even larger for 6 to 8 people. If someone were to walk into, let's say, apartment B, as they would call this, so you have your block number, we could say block 20, you have your barrack number out of the 12 barracks, let's say barrack 1, and then you had your apartment letter. Let's say it was the second apartment, so B, so you might have an address of 21, letter B. So if you were to walk into B, as well as was A, C, D, E, and F, you would realize that there really wasn't any partitions in this space. And when you look at the oral histories and hear the stories of survivors, that specific openness was something that a lot of folks remembered. When they came in, there was a potbelly stove, a single light bulb that was dangling, and army cots. And some folks who may have served in the military might say, well, I lived in an army barrack. Maybe it wasn't even so bad in their experience, potentially. But we have to keep in mind that these were folks from young babies who were born here in this concentration camp to 90-year-olds who did not make this choice to actively come into this space. And this was a huge change in their lived experiences from the Pacific Northwest. As Japanese Americans began to live within this space, folks built furniture out of lumber that they were able to steal off the side or corroborate to make that happen, just to make the lived experience a little better. Japanese Americans were able to order from the Sears Roebuck's catalog or Montgomery Ward with the little money that they would have had saved or had made during the incarceration under work there to be able to beautify that space a little bit. Some Japanese Americans even hung string and made partitions with bed sheets such that they could have a little bit of privacy, providing space for their children to live, and maybe they themselves and their own parents, the grandparents, to have their own section. But nonetheless, the stories of the Japanese Americans who were living within barracks were the same as those outside who first were walking through in dust, sandstorms, the wind, the barren openness, the dust finding their way through the cracks of these barracks that were made of green wood. And as green wood dries, it shrinks and knotholes become developed. These are the stories when they first arrived. And if you look at photos of Japanese Americans who are living in barracks in World War II today, some of the photos might show something a little bit different, maybe something that's more beautified. And that would be a testament to the efforts of these families for the sake of their children, which is a mantra that was mostly spoken here at Minidoka and the other camps to make the space a livable area. But also makes you consider who was behind that camera lens and for what reason was this photo of a beautified barrack taken? Was it for the American public? Was it for the notion to show it wasn't as bad as it may have actually been? But thanks to the stories of our survivors who bravely shared these stories, we know the reality of what it was, a truly inhumane condition for people who had no reason to be there other than their race.
Right. And as you say, I mean, the stark contrast between the Pacific Northwest, the coastal Pacific Northwest in Portland and Seattle, these places that are essentially in deciduous rainforests, to then go from that to the high desert, as you call it properly, right, in central Idaho. That's a really stark shift, especially for people who definitely did not make this migration by choice in any way, right?
Yeah.
But now it seems that this place that was, very tragically but bravely called home by Joni's mother does seem to be a place of regular pilgrimage, because there is something that has stuck within the context of survival and within the generational trauma that you mentioned earlier. And so these places like Minidoka are now sites of pilgrimage on a yearly basis. And I think that's a really fascinating element of the work that you do there. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that as well.
Absolutely. And this notion of pilgrimages are so important in multiple cultures. But when someone speaks of the word pilgrimage for the Japanese American community, it speaks directly to this experience of incarceration. And just as the word says, it is a returning of the people, it's a returning of people like Joni and her family. And I was able to be there when her extended family came with her for the first time since incarceration to return to Minidoka to speak on that experience. The pilgrimage has been happening unofficially prior to 2003, but truly officially from 2003 as an organized event. And the Minidoka one specifically was primarily organized by the Minidoka Pilgrimage Planning Committee based out of Seattle with support from the Friends of Minidoka and of course us here at the National Park Service. And it is truly the most important event that we put on at Minidoka. It happens in the summer, usually around that July 4th weekend when it's extra hot. And let's just say extra indicative of the experience of those who may have been here at that time. But it is a multi-day event in which people are learning in learning sessions, sharing in generational sharing sessions, and also touring the site, walking into these historic buildings, ranger-led tours through these areas. But even within the ranger-led tours, when we have a survivor who, when they walk into the mess hall building, or when they walk into the fire station, or even into our visitor center, and they have this emotional reaction that brings up a memory that may have been hidden and locked away. For us, it's a day when we, even as rangers, take a step back and allow the survivor to have that space to be able to share their story in the way that they feel safe and in a communal area. This pilgrimage has, as we said, been going on for many years now. And while we've shifted virtually for the past few years because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we really are hoping to be able to visit, or to encourage people to visit and come back again on their own personal pilgrimages, if they will, during this upcoming season. And potentially we look forward to future in-person pilgrimages again when they do happen. And the best part, if I may, is that this remembrance activity isn't just something that's unique to Minidoka. It is something that is done across the other 10 incarceration camps, as well as many others across our nation as well. Manzanar comes to mind, and there happens usually in April. Heart Mountain will be having theirs this year, I believe, in late July. And I could probably keep going and describing the pilgrimage circuit, as some of us say. But each camp having its own population of people who are incarcerated and having its own groups that hold those stories. Each pilgrimage is truly special. And if there's any experience that I could encourage anybody watching this video to consider, to be truly humbled in the experience and truly be brought in to a Japanese American community who is looking to share the story out, not just within our own ethnic communities, but even further to connect with those who may have shared experiences, whether it's Muslim Americans who were discriminated against harshly after the falling of the Twin Towers, whether it's Latinx Americans who are continually facing discrimination because of the origin of their parents and their families, of documentation, whether it's any group of people who are discriminated against because of their race, gender, sexuality, what have you. This experience of otherness is what connects this story to the oppression of many other peoples. And we found that connection allows pilgrimages to be healing, whether it's for the survivor or the ally who shows up for that multi-day event.
So I just want to make clear that these pilgrimages are not closed events in any way, shape, or form, but they are open and invitational for anybody who's interested in learning more and having that specific experience with the community that's there to remember.
Absolutely. And some pilgrimages even organize extensively and with purpose towards bringing in other communities who have shared experiences so that they could have not just a healing experience, but also an educational experience, looking at, as Dr. Frank Kitamoto said at the beginning of our talk, right, how this is not just a Japanese American story, but really getting into the implications for the world. The pilgrimage tries to instill that portion. So while, yes, we center the experience, the lived experience of the survivors and their immediate descendants, it is highly encouraged for those who are interested and have and come with an open heart to learn the story in person. It's encouraged for all people to come learn and to walk these grounds together with the community.
I'm sure that's a really, really powerful experience for everybody involved. And I'm also interested to know a little bit about your own personal experience of that process, of that pilgrimage process, as somebody whose family shares in this historical trauma that we've been talking about. What does that pilgrimage and this process of coming together in community mean for you personally, if you'd be willing to share your own personal story?
Yeah, of course. And Dan, I appreciate you bringing it up. I feel like I should have said this at the beginning, but right, I myself, I'm a descendant of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. My grandfather, through marriage, was incarcerated in a camp called Poston in Arizona, and was later transferred, where the majority of his memories from that time were in Texas, in a place called Crystal City. And in terms of pilgrimage and in my own family experience, I think the way I want to connect it is when I was young, prior to me even dreaming of the Park Service, I was still a high school teacher at that point. My grandfather, prior to his passing of cancer, sadly, had made a wish for me and him to take a pilgrimage together. He learned that Crystal City in Texas had their own reunions, these pilgrimages, but he had missed the boat. And I believe he may have known that his time was coming to an end, and he started saving money off the side and making these plans, and would speak of these plans even as he got sick, of how he was going to take me and show me where he was when he was 8 years old. Tragically, he does pass away before we're able to do this. So my best friend and I, when I was still a high school teacher, during one of the summers, took a train, from Los Angeles, California, and then a rental car from San Antonio. And we drove that way to Crystal City. I didn't really know what to expect. And when I got there, it was a school, which I thought was just so, as a high school teacher myself, such an interestingly, maybe ironic experience of sorts. And as I walked the grounds of the school, heartbroken of not seeing what I thought I would see, some sort of commemorative building or a visitor center even. I came upon about 6 to maybe half a dozen or so plaques that actually marked what this land was as Crystal City, a camp where not just Japanese Americans, but even a handful of German and Italian American families were incarcerated at that time. And then I walked the grounds of the school, and my best friend and I, kind of walking in silence, we saw not a water tower, but almost like a water. It's a cylinder, but nonetheless having Crystal City pilgrimage, and I believe there's a few years that was painted on there. And I had this moment of realizing this remembrance was happening, has been happening, and had been happening, and will be continuing to happen. Even though I myself, as a private citizen, not knowing my own history or my community deeply in that way, recognize. So for me, seeing how Crystal City is preserved and remembered only gives me more deeper connection, if I may, or even a small bit of pride in working here at Minidoka at a national park site, a national historic site that says this land is preserved. This land is preserved in perpetuity because the story is so important to the making of this country. So when I do have the opportunity of showing a group of school children or a descendant or even a survivor and walk them through these historic buildings, I think about my own experience with my grandfather and how I would have liked to do this with them, and how I could say for somebody else's family, this place will be here forever, so that your children and your great-grandchildren can look back and say, this is where my family's understanding of this country came from. And this is why great-grandma is the way she is. And this is why our family must continue to ensure this never happens again to anybody else. So it's very personal for me.
Yeah. But I think you're pointing to also something that's really profound about the way that place and space plays into our understanding of who we are and our own location in the world, be it geopolitical or historical or ethnic, or however we see ourselves, that place and space really contributes a great deal in a very profound way to that understanding of self. And knowing your story of your family's incarceration in this system by the government that you now work for is just interesting to me, that you are now an employee of the same government that imprisoned your grandfather. And I'm wondering how you reconcile that on a daily basis.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think about my predecessor, Hanako Wakatsuki, who a lot of folks may know as well. And she would always, during one of her tours, would point to her badge and say, this badge wears heavy on me. This badge is the same badge that, just like as you said, incarcerated my family, that displaced my family, that tore apart my community. And when I think about the context of America, right, as a whole, and I think about not just Minidoka, the Japanese American community, of what it means to us in the 1940s, but as I think about the Shoshone-Bannock tribes and the Shoshone-Paiute tribes and the Shoshonean peoples as a whole, who continues to call this area of the United States home, who were displaced and forcibly removed, and using similar terms as we could probably say today of the Japanese American incarceration, whose lands were taken, stolen from them. I remember that the land that I stand on, as I give these tours, are not just one that I have claim to, but one truly that we must acknowledge that the indigenous people of these lands claim to as well. So when I think about the badge that I wear, right, and whether it's heavy or not, is I think one that has to be coupled with the important responsibility of being a person of Japanese ancestry and a park ranger. When we think of the National Park Service, a lot of folks may have great memories of beautiful places like the Tetons or Yellowstone or Yosemite. As my grandfather, he himself loved Yosemite, and talked about how Yosemite was just the most beautiful place in the United States, and how important it is to protect it. I don't even think he knew that places like Minidoka were protected with the same exact love and care that a place like Yosemite is cared for, because of how beautiful it is. We here stand because of how important we are to the American people. And when I think of how this badge represents the same government that incarcerated over 120,000 people who looked like me, people who I know directly, I think of how important it is to have people who look like the people who were here to tell this story directly. Not saying that that's the most important or the only aspect to what makes someone effective in this part of work, but truly to say that a young visitor, can walk up and can see Park Ranger Emily, who I have the privilege of working with as our lead park ranger here, and see a woman of color, so see a woman of mixed ancestry, who could also say that her family was incarcerated in World War II, to say, I feel like I understand this person just on a deeper level. I think that is such an important piece. And that is one of the goals here at Minidoka, as well as all of our national parks, is to make it a truly more inclusive space. Is it a struggle to put on my badge every day? Absolutely not. Do I feel the importance of my family history as I put on this badge? Absolutely. And do I look forward to making sure that the next young park ranger comes to our park and gets inspired because they see someone who looks like them working here? Well, that's the goal of our job.
Fantastic. Wow. Well, thank you so much for expressing that complexity and the nuances there so eloquently. It's really remarkable, the work that you're doing, and the work that you are standing for. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time with me today. Unfortunately, we are out of time now. So I just want to thank you once again for everything that you've shed light on about Minidoka National Historic Site, and really encourage everybody to come out and take a visit with you. When is the upcoming pilgrimage? When's the next pilgrimage opportunity for people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the pilgrimage, we hope to be able to have the very big public pilgrimage. We're hoping the next few years might provide that opportunity. So while that isn't available this year, I highly encourage folks to put May 27th on their calendar, Friday, Saturday, Sunday from the summer season for 3 months until September 5th. We are open to the public from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And we have public tours that run from 11 o'clock on both Saturdays and Sundays. And if anybody is interested in learning more, please go onto our website. I believe there'll be a link, hopefully at the bottom of this video, that folks can access to. And as I wrap our conversations up, Dan, thank you for connecting us together. Thank you for connecting both of our stories and the missions of our organizations that we represent together, as well as folks make that parallel. And I hope that people who are viewing today continue to make that parallel, not just between the experience that is described at the Jewish Museum Milwaukee, or not just here at Minidoka National Historic Site, but to continue to make connections across all communities who have been marginalized and continue to face oppression because of who they are. And hopefully we'll continue, both you and I, and the work that we do, to make a more inclusive society as we aim to do with our work.
Well, I can't possibly top that as a wrap up, Kurt. That's why I had you, because you're doing my job for me. So I'll just say thanks to everybody for watching. Be sure to come on down to JMM between now and May 29th to see Then They Came for Me. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.